I'm the Education and Programming Director for the Urbanist. I use he, him pronouns. I'm going to start with a quick land acknowledgement. We'll acknowledge that we're on the traditional lands of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past and present, and honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. I also want to, for those of you who don't know, I want to say a little bit about the Urbanist, that we're a donor and volunteer-powered organization that examines urban policy to improve cities and the quality of life. And as Doug said, if you'd like to donate or volunteer to support the work we do, please reach out. It's through your support that we've been able to grow as much as we have these last few years, which includes hiring a part-time executive director, Doug, our managing editor, editing an East Side correspondent, and being able to pay some writers for the work that they do, and we really appreciate your support. I also want to plug an upcoming event. Our next meetup is May 10th. We'll have King County Council member Claudia Balducci, which is very exciting. With that, I'd like to introduce Marc Dones, the first Chief Executive Officer of the King County Regional Homelessness Authority. We're very excited to be joined by them this evening. Appointed April 2021, Marc is a social entrepreneur, policy strategist, and social justice activist with over 10 years experience in equitable systems transformation. Prior to taking on this role, Marc was founder and executive director of the National Innovation Services, a consulting firm that helps governments redesign their approach to supporting marginalized populations. And with that, I'll hand it over to Marc.
Hello, I'm Marc. I use they and pronouns. I'm happy to be here with you all tonight. I think, if I'm right, that you will mostly be asking me questions. But just to do some framing, so I started this job in April of 2021, April 26th, so I'm not yet a full year. It is a date that is seared into my memory. And was a staff of one. I spent the first day trying to stand up an email address for myself. And my Zoom account, like my personal Zoom account, is forever messed up because I used my personal credit card to just buy a Zoom account. And then when I had to switch it over to being a government account, the accounts didn't merge right. And now invites from my calendar are forever broken. So that's where we were. And where we are today is we're an agency of about 55 people. Our first budget is passed and in operation. It's about $170 million, along with some private capital for some catalytic initiatives on top of that, for a total of around 180, 185. Most of our work in this first year we level funded. We didn't have time. I didn't have time with the bandwidth we had to rebid the system in any significant way in 2021. And so much of the system that you see is the system that we had. And the majority of our work has been focused on building out the necessary data and doing the design work. And then now starting to stress test that design with various partners at different levels of government and in the community and with the providers to make sure that when we do rebid the system and actually turn the lights on a new thing from a services perspective, that it's all the right stuff, that we're able to measure it correctly, et cetera. And I say all that because I think, it's just important that folks understand sort of where in the sort of sequence of turning things on we are. I still very much consider us in, the sort of first 18-ish months, right? 20-ish months of startup space where we are not running the system as our team, I think, imagines that system could be and really what it could do, right? So my hope is that, through our conversation this evening, that we can talk, frankly, very candidly about what's not working. I think I don't feel precious about the things that don't work. As was mentioned in my bio, I've done a lot of entrepreneurship. I believe that failure is not a moral issue. It just is a thing that happens sometimes. Things don't work. And the job of good governance is to recognize that those things are not working and appropriately pivot or restructure, right? And so I hope that we have an opportunity to dive into those things and really talk about them. Because the other thing that I feel very strongly about is that this work will only be really accomplished, the work of ending homelessness in our community will only be really accomplished when we're all doing it, right? And that it is not just the work of providers or just the work of the authority, but rather that all of us in one way or another are part of making the necessary changes that need to happen in order for us to really go to scale in ending homelessness. Some of that is about revenue, some of it is about zoning, some of it, there are all kinds of pieces of that. But the important thing is that all of us, as residents of the county and just broadly interested folks, right, like have, I believe, a fundamental responsibility in changing the narrative, in championing the appropriate changes, and showing up at the right, public meetings to voice the importance of doing the right thing instead of, often what we hear. And so I do fundamentally think that like part of my job, part of the job of the agency is to connect with folks in order to build that community understanding and build that broad coalition. So just excited to get a chance to do that tonight.
Great.
Oh, and I'm also, sorry, I'm at a conference, and so if my audio or any of my video breaks up, I apologize in advance. And this is not my normal background. So like, I guess don't think this is my office. This is much cooler than my office.
Great, thank you. Just for those people who maybe might not know, what's the big vision with the Regional Homelessness Authority, and how do you see it?
I mean, I think the big vision is end homelessness, and and I want to be clear, like that for me, that's not facetious, right? Like I think it's really important that we say, the job is not to reduce, it's not to manage, it's to end, right? Like homelessness shouldn't exist. It shouldn't exist nationally. It shouldn't exist in a community that has the resources that our community has. Full stop, right? And so I believe that is the job of the authority, and our strategic planning aligns with driving in that direction. I think my job for my tenure at the authority is to set up the engine that's going to get that done, right? And to get that engine running and demonstrating, right? Like what is possible when you have the right stuff in the right place, measured the right way, et cetera. I don't know if we'll see that true end in my tenure, and that's okay. But what is absolutely true is that while I am at the authority, I want to see significant reduction in, if not the end of, unsheltered homelessness in particular, right? And I want to be really clear that ending unsheltered homelessness is not ending homelessness, because shelter is not a home, right? We need to make sure that people are getting to permanent housing, whatever that may be. But I believe very strongly that no one should be forced to sleep outside. And we need to do as much as we can as quickly as possible to ensure that we are ending that reality.
Thanks. So I spoke with my neighbor this morning, who I share childcare with, who is a homeless outreach worker for King County. And I was like, I'm going to talk to Mark today. What do you think I should ask them? She's like, when will we see progress? She said, there's been so much, this isn't you, this is just that there's been so much talk, and there was so much work on the authority even before you got hired. But I think there's an impatience in the region to see movement forward. So when do you think we'll start seeing progress? And then also, what do you think, as you said, as you've dug into this, what do you think some of the obstacles of that progress are? And what do you think things that we are doing right that you want to build off of are?
I would say, just in terms of straightforwardly, when will we start seeing progress? That depends on sort of where you're looking. So one of the things that and I mean literally where, because one of the things that our agency is doing is taking an approach that is focused in geospatially, right? So like from our perspective, at the resourcing that we have, it isn't possible to run an operation that is, you know, doing everything everywhere at full volume, right? Like we're not resourced in that way. And so rather than taking the approach of saying we can peanut butter these resources around, or we can, you know, attempt to boil the ocean, so to speak, that the best approach is to pick places where there's a high level of need and try to drive a high level of impact, right? And so that's part of the reason why in our Partnership for Zero work, we have focused specifically on downtown Seattle as the place that has the highest concentration of folks who are experiencing chronic unsheltered homelessness, right? And I would expect to see the beginnings of movement in terms of folks getting access to system advocates and resources and beginning to find pathways inside in the latter half of this year for that downtown work, right? Now, if you're saying, when will we see movement in Issaquah, that's farther out, right? Like, and the reality is that right now, when I look at sort of a map of the county, I see that map in you know, sort of resource concentration and resource void, right? So I don't have anything in Issaquah. I don't have anything. There's a single shelter in Snoqualmie Valley, right? And so for some of those areas of the county, there's an infrastructure development that is going to be necessary in order to begin to generate the movement that we need to see. So that is, and I also want to be really honest. I understand the impatience. I think it's right to be impatient with something that is, you know, from my perspective, a humanitarian crisis. And I also want to just be very straightforward. We're in 30 years-ish of a hole, right? Like this has been made over time, and it's going to take pretty significant work to just to turn it around, let alone get us out of that hole that we're in. And I also want to just lift up, and that's why I like opportunities to speak in you know, less large venue formats, right? Is because I also think that we've done a disservice in talking about ending homelessness by overpromising, frankly, by saying, oh, this isn't very complicated, or we'll do that in 3 months, or, you know, things that don't make sense, don't actually map onto what the work is, right? And in our pursuit of you know, good sound bites, or in our pursuit of not having people be upset with where we are, we have, I think, flattened the issue and made it seem like, you know, complication was action avoidance, right? And so what I just want to be really clear about is, like, I want you to hear me really clearly that, like, there is no action avoidance here. We've, you know, I raised extra money so we could begin to do this, you know, neighborhood specific work. We are, you know, we already hired people. There will be boots on the ground downtown within about a month and a half, beginning to, again, connect folks. So, like, where we can move fast, we will always move, not just quickly, but frankly, maybe too fast sometimes, because I mean, it's just not acceptable to say, like, oh, we gotta slow walk it while people have to live outside, right? But I also won't lie to you and tell you that a thing is simple when it is in fact not.
That's great, thanks. So the King County Regional Housing Homelessness Authority was held up as the name says, there's a regional solution, but it seems, at least from my perspective, before you came on, a lot of the many of the jurisdictions were trying to undermine the effort, even before it started, by passing their own tax to prevent the county from getting revenue to spend, or passing limits on homeless shelters and whatnot in their jurisdictions. Do you feel like all the cities and the counties view this as a regional problem and have your back, or do they want to continue to push the problem onto Seattle and blame it on Seattle?
I think we are in a very different place than where we were before I came on, and even right after. And I think two things are important there. One is just I think that there was a belief because the authority as a legislative in terms of like what is written, right? Like we sort of, and this was written about a lot in the Times and other places, right? Like we have a lot of power, right? Like we can mandate things, we can yada yada yada. And so I think that there was a lot of fear that whoever came to lead the authority and the senior team at the authority would be very autocratic, right? And so I think cities entered into a protective stance for fear that it would not be a collaborative process by which we all sort of collectively architected how are we going to do this? What is our what are our different roles in it? And I think that since we've come, since the team is now real, and we've got a very talented sub-regional planning manager, and we've begun to really do a lot of that engagement. I think a lot of that anxiety has dropped substantively, and I feel like we're in a very different place in terms of the conversations we're having now than we were. The other thing that I think is important, and from my perspective, is a shift in the tone, is that we have started to have more data-driven conversations, right? And so we are able to say now with higher levels of clarity than we were, and this will continue to be refined. Where are people from in the county, right? So what we know is that a lot of people wind up in Seattle because there is a concentration of services in Seattle, right? And so at first blush, right, like, some of the efforts to, frankly, get people back to their communities of origin might look like, oh, you're busing people from Seattle to, wherever, right? But the reality is that, when I talk with folks who are experiencing homelessness, they're like, oh, well, I'm trying to get back to South County. I'm trying to get back to, East, like they're trying to get back to where they're from, where their communities are, where they're actually, feel the most connection and have natural and community resources that they could activate that are outside of the, the formal system. And we can talk about that now in a data-driven way that is different from what we were able to say before. And what we've been really clear with our, city partners around the region is that our goal is to ensure that every community has the capacity to care for folks who experience housing instability in where they're from, right? Like you shouldn't have to move in order to get support. I remember speaking with one person who was staying in a shelter in South County, and I was just saying, what are some of your concerns? Like, what can we do? Like, what would be a thing that you would really want to make sure didn't happen? And they said, I just really want to make sure I don't end up in Seattle, right? Like, so the idea that people are coming from Seattle is false, right? Folks are actually doing everything in their power not to have to go downtown, right? They understand that is not an ideal setting. So those things I think have really shifted the tone. I think that we can do more still, and just briefly what I'll say, and part of what I was saying in terms of the importance of people going to the council meetings, et cetera. We need people across the county to show up and help to demonstrate that there are more voices who want low-income housing options, more voices who want affordable and walkable communities than those who don't, right? And right now, the unfortunate reality is, if you go to a public meeting, you would think that no one wants anything built ever. And we know that's not true, right? We know that people are like, I would love transit, I would love a grocery store. Like, these are things that anybody would like very much, or not anybody, but many people, right, would very much want to be part of their neighborhood, part of their community. And those voices, right? What we know, what the data tells us, like literally the research on community meetings, is that there's a stronger predictor of going to the meeting if you feel negatively about the topic than if you feel positively about it, right? And so we really need those of you who hold those pro-housing, pro-density, pro-transit viewpoints to go to those meetings. And I know that's awful, and they're at weird times, and they're at dinner, and it's never great. But we need your voices in order to demonstrate very clearly that as appointed and elected officials, we are carrying out the community will.
That's great. And that's great to hear that you're making progress on changing the regional perception of the homelessness crisis. It's real positive. Speaking of perception, in our region and probably many other regions with the same issue, it seems difficult to even have a conversation about homelessness. There's a large contingent who seem to blame people for their own poverty, or assume that they're all drug addicts or criminals, or even worse, they came here because it's Seattle and they just don't want to work. It seems like there's a whole media ecosystem that supports this view. But then when I talk to people like my neighbor, or I think the Scott Greenstone from the Seattle Times said a similar thing. They said the best part of their job is interacting with the people and hearing their stories and learning about them as human beings. How do you think we can break these negative stereotypes and create a more human picture, or do we need to? Is it again just negative voices that will be negative voices? Create these perceptions.
I think we can do better in terms of breaking down some of those negative perceptions. And what I would offer is that I think I would like us to have more, and I'm actually working right now to try to pilot this. But I would like us to have, so currently we have day centers, right? And day centers for people who are experiencing homelessness, where it's the place to be during the day. What I'm working on with some members of our team is trying to figure out how to make those day centers more community centers, right? Where there's stuff for people who are housed as well, right? And so that it is not just a place for people experiencing homelessness to be during the day, but it is just a community asset. And there's good reason for housed folks to be there. There's good reason for unhoused folks to be there. And there is the opportunity to interact, right? I think that, one of the things that we in government actually have real power to do is to help shape community discourse by shaping space, right? You all know this. This is what you think about. You are urbanist people. And so I'm trying to figure out ways that we can literally build, right, more points of meaningful contact where some of those narratives that we see in the media can be dispelled at the level of the person, right? And I think that when we approach this through relational architecture and thinking about how do we get people to interact differently, and how do we create the capacity for that to be meaningful and real, I think the other thing that I would say is again, and I think this is why it's critical for there to be always the other voices coming to the meetings, et cetera. There is a correlation, between homelessness and crime at the level of encampments that has been rendered in the media, I think in a number of spaces as causal, right? And the social scientist in me is deeply aggrieved by any idea that correlation is ever causation, right? We should never have a conversation about correlation as a causal phenomenon. I heard a terrible talk at this conference where someone tried to essentially say that, well, it doesn't matter. They basically said that there were a series of economic conditions that had led to longer lifespans writ large. which is a correlation event and has nothing to do with the advent of modern medicine, which actually has let people live longer, right? So what I would say is that, you know, I think that it is really important that we be pushing back on that narrative as often and as vocally as it appears, right? And that the statistics, the actual research statistics are quite clear. People experiencing homelessness are more likely to be victims of violent crime, victims of assault, than they are to be perpetrators. About 70-some% of folks experiencing homelessness report being assaulted multiple times over the course of the last year, right? These are the things that are just factual. And so when we have these very skewed narratives about, you know, what folks experiencing homelessness are doing, I think we need to be really clear that, you know, while I certainly will not go out and say like, well, everyone is an angel, it's just the likelihood is that most people are being victimized, not they are you know, actively driving crime issues. The other thing that I would say, and this is just a slight nuance, is that there are a number of instances actually that are well documented where people who are housed, like, you know, very sophisticated, like retail theft rings that are like international in scope and need the attention of certainly not a county agency or a city agency, but like, you know, someone above us, will, you know, use runners that are people experiencing homelessness who literally, like, they'll be, you know, said, hey, if you, I'll give you $50 if you run into the Target and grab X, Y items, and I'll give you another 50 if you get back out with them, right? That is a thing that we know happens, right? So even when we are seeing the you know, person who is, you know, doing the crime is a person experiencing homelessness, I would just ask that we always sort of, you know, ask a series of questions about like, what is the actual driver here? And are we seeing actually another form of victimization, right? And how do we disrupt that, right? I think, you know, how are we making sure, a thing that I would love to be able to do, right, is ensure that folks have access to the material supports they needed, to the money that they needed in order to get their basic needs met, that wasn't an appealing offer, right? Like that to me is the thing that I hear when I hear things like that, is how do I make sure that you have access to food, access to medicine, access to, you know, cash if it's just like you need money, right? That is not coming through you know, illicit paths, but is you know, being provided because you deserve it as a person who has dignity.
Thanks for that answer. That was great. So jumping back to big picture solutions, and this is going to be a silly question, but do you think you have what you need to make progress against homelessness and to solve it? Or what additional resources do you think you need?
I mean, simply no, we don't have the resources that we need. You know, what I would say is our system is currently indexed essentially against flawed point in time count data. So that 11,000 to 20,000 number that has, you know, floated around in the community, we know to be false. And the true number of people minimum is roughly 45,000 folks are experiencing homelessness in the county. That's based on some very good administrative data analysis that was done in the fall in partnership with our colleagues at the Department of Community and Human Services. You know, and candidly, currently we generate about 6,000 housing exits per year. And the system has roughly 5,000 shelter beds in it. And so if we only had 11,000 people who were experiencing homelessness, no one would have to be outside. Like that wouldn't be necessary, right? So the issue here really is about, you know, scaling the right infrastructure and correcting for some historical harms that have kept people stuck. So there's just a significant resourcing issue, right? And it's just, you know, this is the unpleasant thing, is it's a dollars thing, right? Like we would need significantly more money to scale all the things that we're doing in order to be truly responsive. The other thing that I'll say is just, our system is deeply fragmented, very siloed. It has been, from my perspective, overly focused on shelter and not, yielded the adequate generation of various forms of permanent housing, inclusive of various supportive housing types, and instead has focused on how do we stand up the next shelter? How do we stand up the next tiny home village? And the one after that, and the one after that, and the one after that. And none of these things, are actually going to move people into housing if the housing is not being, constructed again along at the appropriate pace alongside it, right? And so we need to right size the investments there and make sure that we are not just constantly standing up a more complex and more Byzantine shelter system, and are actually saying, we can stand up housing models in the same time it takes to stand up a tiny home village. I mean, to be quite frank, right? We have gone the route of more shelter instead of more emergency housing, more SRO, more et cetera. And so we need to right size that and right size those investments as we hopefully also scale those investments. And then maybe just one, to make this answer even longer still, maybe one other quick addition would be to say that, when we are thinking about going to scale, we also need to be responsive, again, in terms of correcting things to what people with lived experience and what people who are currently experiencing homelessness tell us, and how the system is not, it doesn't provide enough relational architecture for them to actually navigate the things that they need to navigate. That's why we launched our System Advocates program, which is a peer navigation model, and why we've been really focused on building out more and more of that relational infrastructure, because we see the data from other systems, not homelessness systems, behavioral health, et cetera, that do that quite successfully, and we hear that as one of the clear and consistent asks from our unhoused neighbors.
So staying on something you spoke of, which is basically the solution to homelessness is housing. So even if Seattle was given $1 billion, billions of dollars to build housing tomorrow, it would take 3 or 4 years just to design, permit, and construct it. And we don't even actually have the money. So what is that balance between using our lands and funds for short-term housing versus long-term housing and all the services that are required?
On the physical asset component, my answer to that is acquisition, right? I think, any day, right? So King County, while the housing is very expensive, and there's a dearth of density, there is not actually you can buy every day, things are for sale, right? So it certainly isn't, and I want to be clear when I say this, there are markets where that's not true. There are markets where you can't buy, right? Where you will wait for things to be available, and that isn't the case here. And we should count ourselves lucky that we have not reached that point of market collapse. It's coming, just so we know, just so we're all having the same conversation, but we're not there. And until we're there, what we need to be doing is buying, right? And we need to be saying, how do we, more motel, hotel acquisition and conversion, more, duplex and even single family acquisition and conversion, so that we can stand up more and more, things that are in the, again, SRO, emergency housing, and that again, just to be very transparent, the cost of doing that is roughly the same in many instances as standing up a new shelter, right? It is equivalent, and so it's been a policy choice to choose shelter over that strategy.
That's really interesting. I hadn't ever thought about it in that same way, especially when you think about acquisition, where it's instantly available, as opposed to what I think Seattle's traditionally done, which is put things out to bid, get a service provider who will build something from scratch. It seems like I've seen that more and more happening, the purchasing. Um, so what do you think? It sounds like, and I know you've said this in the past, it's like that there's a skepticism towards tiny house villages, which seems to be a very popular solution. I know several council members are big fans. Can you talk about your thoughts on that?
Sure. I'm not quite sure how to effectively disabuse folks of the notion. I think well, let me just say this. I am often described as being skeptical of tiny homes. I am not skeptical of tiny homes in the sense that, like, you know, they're there, they exist, they serve a shelter function, right? Like, what I have said is that I have concerns about lengths of stay in tiny homes, right? About, like, how are we making sure that people are moving on to housing? And what I've also said, and where I think the skepticism comes in, is, like, again, there has been a very consistent drive. You know, there was one campaign to build, you know, I think 10 or 12 new tiny home villages. And as an administrator who's supposed to be, I shepherd tax dollars, right? Public dollars. I can't justify that cost against the other acquisition strategies I just talked about, right? Like, it doesn't pencil. And so that, I think, is this, like, if I am skeptical, it is skepticism about, like, is this the decision I should make with public money, right? And I don't feel that level of expansion, right, is the appropriate thing to do with that much public resource. I think the other thing, right, that I also want to be really clear about is I have not proposed at any point in time shutting down our current tiny home infrastructure, right? Like, and let me be very clear, like, I think this is clear in my public persona, but let me be clear with you all. If I really thought something didn't work, you couldn't stop me from, I would just like, this is done. But, like, what is very clear is that there is an appropriate number of tiny homes, and we might be at it. We have roughly 500-ish beds, right, of tiny home infrastructure. And the other thing that I would say, just again, when we're sort of driving the point home, is that our recent non-congregate shelter RFP funded 2 new tiny home villages. So, like, there is clearly nothing in the policy decisions that are being made by me or by this agency that are saying this is the worst thing and it can never happen. That is a narrative that some people have found it convenient to advance, and that's on my job. That's not whatever, right? But it is just straight counterfactual. Like, it just, like, doesn't make sense. I am not in a fight with tiny homes. If I was, they'd be gone by now. Like, that's how I fight. I'm from the Midwest. We just get it done. So, you know, the question I think we need to be asking, and I you know, again, I'm open to having this conversation in the remainder of the time we have left if anyone wants to dive into it, is scaling that particular shelter asset at that level of expense the right decision with scarce public resource, when I could open, quite literally, I've got an opportunity in one space. I could generate 100 beds of SRO shelter for the same cost as opening a new tiny home village with about 40 beds.
Well, thanks for addressing that, and sorry for repeating a misnomer.
It's fine. I answer it everywhere I go, and apparently I will answer it until I am done at this job. Fine.
Oh my gosh, sorry, it's like got stuck on you and just won't go away. We'll try to squash it. We'll do our best to squash that.
Thank you.
So you talked a little bit a minute ago about the collapse of the housing ecosystem, or in the larger picture. And I just read, was it Housing is a Homelessness Problem? Homelessness is a housing problem, and you probably people listening probably heard most of the spiel, which is, that the only thing that correlates with homelessness is vacancy and the cost of rent. And in Seattle and this region, it's just spiraling out of control. It seems like we've known it's a crisis for years, and yet it continues to be a worsening crisis. How do we address the pipeline problem of just the general, it's not just people on the street who can't afford housing, it's people of all levels that can't afford housing?
That's right. This takes me into some spaces that the authority doesn't directly oversee. So, this is more of my advocacy hat than anything that I can directly address. And I just want to be very transparent about that, because I think sometimes people think that I have levers I can pull on some of these things, and I don't. Like, I'm in some of these spaces, I am just like you. I will go to the meetings and I will say, that's a terrible idea, or that's a great idea, right? Like, sometimes I'm invited to the meetings, which is nice, I guess, but like, I still don't get to make the choice. So, the first thing, and this is deeply unsexy, but the first thing we need to do is like radically redo our permitting, right? Like, a huge difficulty with pipeline is how long and how expensive it is to permit stuff, right? And I am of the perspective that if you're building low-income housing, particularly extremely low-income housing, you shouldn't be paying for permits, right? Like, that is a service, right? Like, many of the folks who are building in that space are nonprofits. And in fact, right, like, I find it a dubious use of public money, because I'm funding them, or they're being funded by Office of Housing or funded by DCHS with public money that they then turn around and pay back to another part of the public system in fees, right? And that just doesn't square for me, right? So like, the permitting process needs to be radically simplified, and to the extent that we're talking about low income housing, I believe made frictionless and feeless, right? The next thing that we need to address, and this will not surprise you at all, is zoning, right? Like, we actually have to have the zoning conversation. Not everything can be single family. That's just not gonna work. There is no solution to the housing crisis in this country that doesn't involve a density conversation. And I understand that that's challenging for people, and it activates a lot of like, that's good in theory, but how does that operationalize? And I'll tell you how it operationalizes. Things that are higher density get built, and sometimes things that are low density will go away. And that is actually just a thing that we have to say is true. Like, and the sort of fanciful notion that there is a way to keep all this single family infrastructure and somehow also build increasing density, that just doesn't work, right? Like, and so we do have to become comfortable saying there will be some loss of these single family properties as we do appropriate things around density. And like, and I think it's just important that we at the community level have that conversation, get comfortable with it, tell our electeds that we're comfortable with it, and then keep it moving. The third thing that I would say around housing is that, and again, I control none of this. I think it is essential that we prioritize in our housing development, housing for our 0 to 30% AMI bracket, right? That's our folks who are extremely low income or literally homeless, right? And what we have done is every time we start having the let's build more housing conversation, I watch we should build more affordable housing. Workforce housing, 60 to 80% AMI, 80%, so all of a sudden, and the reason is that it just turns out that extremely low income housing doesn't pencil. Again, you operate it at a loss. But the bottom line is that there is no amount of 60% AMI housing that's going to house someone at 12% AMI. It's just not how that works. And so we need to really focus on driving a radical expansion in that 0 to 30% AMI housing bracket as quickly as possible. Again, I think there's an acquisition strategy here as well that we could use. And then when we talk about the more sort of like workforce housing domains, right? I think we need to think about more fully integrated mixed income style property, right? So, I think we do that a little bit, but again, I think, and this is based on my national experience, I don't think we do it amazingly well. I've only seen a couple places that are like, hey, that's a fully integrated building. That's great, right? Like, and so we sort of talk around that integration where we say, you know, well, you're going to get a tax credit because you set aside 10% of the units to be affordable, right? That's not integration. That's not a real mixed use building, right? Real mixed use, we start talking about true, like, hey, this is 30, 40%, and then, you know, and then maybe we do some workforce and then we do some market rate. And we got to do more of that in order to really be transforming how we're doing the housing work. And what I would say is that that's also good for community. Again, if we're building spaces where people are living together, they're like, it's like, oh, poor people aren't scary, right? Like, that is my neighbor. That I think is a much more, then a lot of conversations become easier, right? The last thing I would just say, sorry, is like, we know this works because it worked when we did rent control. And if you're in New York ever, right, then you're ever in an old building, dollars to donuts, right? If you talk to somebody who moved in last year, they're paying like $4,000 a month in rent, right? You talk to somebody who moved in 1990, they're paying like $800 a month, right? Is the person who's paying $800 a bad neighbor? Are they scary? No, they pay rent stabilized rent, right? So like we past is prologue here. We did it, we can do it again.
Great. Those are all great things that I think we at the Urbanist are very excited about working on. So, you know, you mentioned that the importance of that 0 to 30% piece. Seattle passed a jumpstart tax, and in the county, the regional level passed like a little tax. Have you been in any conversations about how we get the money to fund that housing or make this happen?
Not yet. I will say, right, like the authority has no taxing, we're explicitly barred from having that authority in our authorizing legislation. So, and you know, if I could tax, I'm gonna be honest, I would do it. So I took it away, I guess, and that was a good decision. But you know, the thing that we're working on right now, we've got a conceptual model of where we think the system needs to go, inclusive of shelter typologies and housing typologies. And now we are doing a more rigorous sort of gap analysis to identify how many of each kind of thing, and then we're going to cost it out. So, and that'll be in the 5-year plan that we released in September. That's the timeline for that analysis. So in September, we should be in a space to say, this is how much it costs, at which point I will start having some more serious advocacy conversations about the revenue, because I'll be able to say, like, look, at the dollars that are here, this is what we're going to be able to do against what we know we should do, right? And so, like, you know, and my whole thing is like, look, hold me accountable for like what I can do. And if it goes wrong, sure, hold me. But like, I am not going to put myself or this agency in the position of being held accountable for stuff that we are very clear there does not exist a dollar to pay for.
That's great. And I think we'll all look forward to seeing the research you produce in September. We only have 10 minutes left, and I definitely want to get to this next topic, which is under sweeps. They seem very popular under our past mayor, and our current mayor seems like he's doubling down on them. I recently read a quote from you, quote, "We don't support displacement-based strategy, full stop. It isn't data-based and it doesn't produce results we're after," end quote. But if a camp is, quote, "in a place that doesn't work for the whole community, that is a conversation we're grown up enough to have." Could you talk more about that quote and just your attitude on the sweeps we're seeing?
Sure. I mean, like, this is another one of those things where like, I'm like, I don't know how to say this a different way. Like, I don't support displacement-based strategy. The agency doesn't support it. It's not data-based. Like those things are gonna stay true. Like, But the latter part, like we're grown up enough to have this conversation, right? Is like, you know, I think it is absolutely the case that there are times when encampments are in spaces that are disruptive to like broad fabric of community life. And when I say that, I want to be super clear. I'm not talking about an encampment that's just like in the park, right? Like that's not what I mean. What I mean is when, you know, an encampment is, you know, has created some sort of hazard, right? Where either because it has completely obstructed, you know, essential passageways, and, you know, people with mobility issues could not navigate them, or, you know, if we're talking about, you know, for example, encampments that are very close to active construction sites, and they're just safety concerns, right? Like, that's what I mean when I say that, like, you know, an encampment can be in a place that we need to have a conversation about. And when I say that we're grown up enough to have that conversation, what I personally mean is I'm grown up enough to talk to the residents of that encampment. Like that is like, like that's a thing that we can do, right? Like, and you know, some of our system advocate directors, you know, speak to this far more eloquently than I. You know, just like, look, like it is very possible to, you know, chat with someone and be like, hey, tomorrow they're going to open up this section of the sidewalk and it will be unsafe. And like you shouldn't be here when that happens, right? Like, so like, let's just talk about what the options are, right? And I think, you know, to some degree, and I want to actually give some kudos, because I think to some degree, you know, the Parks Department folks do some of that now, right? They you know, they try to talk to people and, you know, say like, hey, this is what's coming, this is, you know, yada, 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 right? They're not really able to do it, I think, at scale. That's where I think our system advocates will really play an essential role. And then again, from a relationship perspective, right? Like we'll be really focused on building the relationship so that we can have those like real, like, let's talk about it conversations. The only other thing I would say on the encampment front is, like, you know, there is another element that is like behaviors in the encampment, right? So like, you know, I won't presume to know your walks of life, but I've spent a lot of time in my life around people who've done like too much meth that night, and it's like, oh, you should do less meth, friend. Like this is a lot of erratic energy, right? And like sometimes that's like then where fires come. I mean, literally, like people are like, I've done a lot of meth, I'm gonna start a fire. Like, again, I feel like I am adult enough to say, like, let's have that conversation with the person who's doing too much meth, right? And what I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting you all are like, I'm gonna go talk to this person about their meth use, right? What I'm saying is, it is our job to do that. And there is literally a number of program models designed for those kinds of interventions, right? So we should be using those kinds of harm reduction strategies, contingency management, talking to people about use and behavior, and helping to create a more supportive environment before we jump to any of those displacement-based strategies, from my perspective.
Thanks. Are you in the Homelessness Authority working with local government and trying to come up with alternatives? That I know you mentioned earlier that you're about to start the big initiative in downtown, and it sounds like part of the goal of that is of lots of peer navigators that will help people find their way to safer locations without having sweeps.
I think that's right, and I think you know, from our perspective, the hope is that we are able to navigate a lot of those needs, some of which, again, I think are again, from my perspective, you know, and I just, you know, for purpose of sharing, like I had to use a cane for about half a year one time because I tore a hole in my knee. And so, like, I'm not being facetious when I say that, like, when it's hard to get through a sidewalk and you have a mobility issue, it actually is really hard. And like, I just, like, totally different life and world hat on, like, this is not a friendly country for people living with disabilities. And it really does matter to me, right? If like people who have mobility issues cannot navigate the world, and we should care about that, right? So I do think that there is a legitimate, set of concerns when, that mobility is impacted, and we should care about that as a community. And again, I think that it's possible to truly 9 times out of 10, if we're doing the upfront work, if we're building the relationships, if the advocates are, working with people and having those relationships, to have that be a conversation rather than an event, right? To talk with people about how do we, a strategy I think we could use much more effectively in some spaces, not all, but some, is just about footprint reduction, right? Like you're taking up X amount of the sidewalk, and how can we talk about Y amount of the sidewalk, right? Like those kinds of things I think are what I would like to see more broadly utilized from a harm reduction perspective, while we are in the development phase of places for people to be, or even just identifying what the appropriate space is as we sort of work with them to, craft their exit.
Great. I think we're almost at time. I just have a couple more questions I want to get to. And I'm sorry, I see some questions in the chat that I don't know if we'll have time to address, but we appreciate them. I believe it was at the Downtown Seattle Association event that I heard you say one of the best things that we as a region can do to end homelessness is pay workers more. Could you explain that?
I don't know. It's just like most of homelessness is economic, right? Like, so there's this misconception that homelessness is this like incredibly, substance use or behavioral health driven thing. And part of that is what's called an incentive salience error, a salience attribution error. I mixed up my neuro terms from a million years ago. And like that error is when you see something a lot, and so you think it is the whole thing, right? It's like that, you think the tail of the elephant is the elephant when you're touching it in the dark, right? And so a lot of the folks we see unsheltered have some of those issues, and so we think that is everybody. It's not, right? It's actually only about 15-ish% of the population experiencing homelessness. 85% of people don't have money, right? And that's the issue. They don't have money. And in fact, for most of those, or not most of those folks, but a lot of those folks who have the other issues, the trend data seems to indicate there needs to be, frankly, from my perspective, more research on this to help clarify. But what we see in a lot of folks' narratives is that they actually start using or have their first significant psychotic break after they are homeless, right? Like the trauma of homelessness actually engenders the thing, as opposed to the reverse, right? And I will say, right, like from in my own experience as a person who's experienced psychosis, I've been unstably housed. There were a lot of things, right? I never had to sleep outside or have a lengthy period of unsheltered homelessness in any way, shape, or form, because, right, of the other resources in my network. And so, like, if people have access to capital, if they are paid more, none of this stuff happens. And so if we raise wages, if we focus on making sure that, people are making, really $80,000 or above based on what median income is, then we would just be in a different county.
Great. I always think that point is so good about how long would it take if we were on the street for our low-level anxiety or depression to spiral when we're in a constant state of free fall. And as for one last closing question, for all the folks who are listening to tonight, what's one thing you hope they take away from this, or when they're talking to their neighbor about this issue, that they will share or would do to help your work?
My hope is that you share that one, people are people, and that there is always something. It's more than data, right? Like people are suffering, and like that should be our highest call should always be to that compassion, to that humanity. I know that sounds Pollyanna, but I really think that we've lost a lot of that in our narrative, and we need to bring it back. And the second thing that I would say is, like, get involved in that boring civic stuff, I really can't stress that enough. Like, go to those zoning meetings, go to those council meetings, go to the thing, be the voices advocating for density, be the voices advocating for the shelter, for the permanent supportive housing, right? We need you there. Democracy is breaking because the only people who show up hate everything. And we need the folks who actually believe in like government and democracy to come back. Please come back.
Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And that was a great note to end on. And also, just want to say I'm so glad that you're in the position that you're in. The attitude and intelligence and analytical skill that you're bringing to this is great. And I really can't wait to see what you do in this role in the next couple of years. Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks for everyone for joining us tonight.